good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us here today at Journalism Under Fire as our first day of sessions kicks off in earnest. We're, of course, today here from Malachi Brown at the New York Times at 1 o'clock Mountain Time, and then EJ Dion from the Washington Post at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Time, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And he'll be in conversation with Dana Priest. I hope you all enjoyed last night as much as I did. It was a great kickoff event. Great pleasure for me, of course, to talk with Dana Priest, who's just such a spectacular individual and adds so much to this conference. And having her in conversation with Nick Kristof and Cheryl Wudunn and hearing from the mayor of Santa Fe as well. Really, really fine start. If you missed it, don't worry, we recorded the whole thing. It's on our YouTube channel. It's on the website, journalismunderfire.org, in our video gallery. And I want to make sure you all see it because it was really worth seeing. I'm going to start today by introducing Pat Talamantes. Good morning, Pat. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Good morning, Sandy. Thanks for having me.
So Pat, you, of course, were the CEO of the McClatchy News Organization. Can you give our viewers just a really quick overview of McClatchy?
Sure. McClatchy is a organization of 30 local newspapers and their websites across cities around the country, going from the Miami Herald all the way out to the Sacramento Bee and the Tacoma News Tribune on the West Coast. It also has an outstanding bureau in Washington, D.C., and it also covered stories overseas through a system of journalists and freelancers, and did award-winning work during that time.
And you, of course, were at McClatchy when Austin Tice was detained in 2012, and I know you've personally been involved on that note. So why don't I turn things over to you, and welcome Marc and welcome Debra, and I welcome hearing your conversation.
Okay, Sandy.
Well, thank you, Sandy. So just as some background, journalist Austin Tice, a freelancer who worked with McClatchy, the Washington Post, CBS News, was detained while reporting from Syria in 2012, more than 8 years ago. So I've known Debra and Marc under the most difficult of circumstances. And as part of our conference theme covering crises, we would like to learn more about Austin, recent efforts to gain his release, and what perspectives the Tices have for journalists who are covering crises globally. Debra and Marc, as you can tell, are in different locations today. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Pat.
So Debra, let's start with you. It's fitting, right, that today is Veterans Day, and yesterday was the Marine Corps birthday, as Austin is a former Marine captain, having served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Debra, we'd like to get some insight into Austin. He went to Syria between what should have been his last 2 years at Georgetown Law School. What is it about Austin that caused him to want to make his trip to Syria?
Well, that's a really broad question with a really deep answer, so I'll try to give you the short version. Like you said, Austin served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was following the Arab Spring very closely, and he actually went to Egypt for spring break to look at Tahrir Square and see what was going on there. So when he left in May to go to Syria, he was actually hoping to only be a photojournalist. He hadn't planned to write, and he wanted to create photos that were so compelling that war could be averted in Syria, and that it could be a peaceful Arab Spring in Syria as well. He took thousands of pictures of children basically wanting to tug the heartstrings and say, let's not have another urban war.
It's a fascinating calling that he had. Marc, did you want to add anything else to that?
Well, I mean, Debra hit Austin's I think, desires and motive right on the nose. One thing I would add is that, honestly, as unfortunately kind of a typical American working dad, I didn't spend all the time that I wish I would have with Austin or his brothers and sisters, while I was traveling for work and so forth. But this experience and learning what Austin did, hearing from people that he talked to and worked with, has made me realize exactly what a remarkable son, what a remarkable man he is. And it's been very eye-opening for me from that perspective.
No, Marc, even as a freelancer, Austin was able to do extraordinary reporting, and as Debra just mentioned, amazing photojournalism while in Syria. And he shared a George Polk Award, a very high honor, with other McClatchy colleagues at the time. What's your sense of Austin's interaction with other journalists covering the Syrian conflict while he was in the field, and how have they been engaged since his capture?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something else that we really had no idea about as parents of a new journalist, but we learned a lot, and we've heard from so many journalists who Austin met in the field while he was working. They would go to, or they'd converge on a city, or there'd be a town where there was a makeshift news center, press center, where they would, be able to rest and before they went back out into reporting. And we've heard from many of those people, and they've all remarked on what collegiality there was between the journalists, whether freelance or full-time journalists for a particular media outlet, and I think that was a huge amount of support for Austin. Since then, when he first went missing, we had a tremendous effort by a number of people, including Clarissa, who's going to be joining us later, and many others. Pat, yourself, the whole McClatchy organization. It's difficult to maintain that kind of intensity for 8 years. It's not difficult for parents, but it's hard for people who have their own families and a full-time job. So we cherish the support that we do get, and the ongoing support and prayers from his colleagues.
Thank you. Now, Debra, you've traveled to Damascus. You both have been to Beirut several times. You're about to deal with third mission and detention. What have you learned about the service community as it pertains to seeking Austin's release, and are there opportunities, try as much as they might, that the U.S. has missed perhaps in securing Austin's release?
So this is our third presidential election since Austin was detained. I started really ringing the bell more than a year ago about the fact that in an election year, it's really hard to focus on one single American in distress. And I was in DC for almost a month in January saying, get him home. We've got to get him home before September, or, it's just going to become much more complicated. And so here I am back in DC, looking at another transition period. But this is also a time of excellent opportunity because President Trump is fully committed to getting Austin home. We finally have had the opening dialogue with the Syrian government. And so basically I'm here in DC to press on that effort, to encourage that effort move forward. If I'm able to engage with the Biden team, I will ask that they support every kind of agreement that may be made during our effort to get Austin out. And I'm really more hopeful than ever because this is an opportune time. And, this can be a really indelible, positive legacy for President Trump. And I know that he really would love to see that happen.
Thank you. That's very encouraging. Mark, sadly, there are too many families that have had similar experiences to yours. For the families of journalists out there who are covering crisis or actually have been detained, what knowledge, what would you like to pass on to them? What would you want them to know about?
Well, I'll pick a couple of the top couple of things that I think, and I'd like Debra to comment on that too. But one of my regrets, or our regrets, I think, is that we didn't become really active. We didn't actively engage in going to Lebanon, going to Syria as soon as Austin was taken captive. So for any family, I would say start acting, engage as quickly as you can. I would also say that if unless you're in the process of negotiating a release, be public about what you're doing. It only makes sense, and that will allow you to garner the kind of support that you're going to need to hopefully quickly resolve the situation.
Thank you. So let's bring it back to Austin. He's been, as you know, he's been detained for more than 8 years, making him the longest detained American journalist, longer even than Terry Anderson of the AP. Debra, you have a campaign going to try to bring Austin home by Thanksgiving and galvanizing the base of supporters that you've built over this period of time to help keep public pressure up on this. What further steps, are there any more steps that you'd like to elaborate in terms of how we get him home by Thanksgiving, which is an important holiday for your family? And if there are others who are on this cast that would like to help you, should they go for more information?
Okay, great questions and two simple answers. Right now, we're asking people to go to the White House website and send an email to the president, just encouraging him, reminding him that he made this commitment, and encouraging him to get us across the finish line. Just like a marathon runner needs a little extra cheerleading on those last 5 miles, right? So that kind of thing. The second part of the question was, say it again, Pat.
If there are other places, is there anything else that people can be doing to help you all, or if they want to reach out with information that they might have about Austin?
Right. So Marc does a really good job maintaining our website, austinticefamily.com. And I do a marginal job on our Facebook page, Free Austin Tice Now. And so we try to keep things current on both of those outlets. Both of them have the ability for you to reach out to us. If you have information about Austin, there's still the $1 million reward for information leading to Austin's safe release. So if you have information about Austin, you'll want to go to the FBI. Get that. I think that the main thing right now is encouraging President Trump to get this done. And to the extent that you might be engaged with the Biden team, encouraging them to be supportive of that effort.
Great. I'm sure lots of folks on this webcast will want to follow up with that. Thank you both for your time today. We wish you both well, and we wish you strength and energy as you push through this hopefully opportune time to bring Austin home. May soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you all so much, and of course our heartfelt wishes go to you as well, that this can come to a happy conclusion sooner than later. This is, of course, Veterans Day, and Austin was in the Marines, and our hearts and prayers are with you and with Austin.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you both. So let me now introduce our next moderator, which is Ignacio Delgado Culebras. And Ignacio is with the Committee to Protect Journalists. And so I wanted to just provide a super quick overview of the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is, a US-based but global organization that works in many different ways, using many different methods to highlight the cases of journalists that have been, abducted or detained or on we go through various different campaigns, and has people like Ignacio working all around the world. So good morning, Ignacio. How are you?
Good morning, Sandy. Thanks for having me. I'm good, thanks.
So tell me, did I miss anything in my description of CPJ that you think is important for our viewers to understand?
Yeah, I think like what you said is pretty accurate. Like we are, as you said, an international organization. We promote press freedom worldwide and try to defend the right of journalists to report the news freely and without fear of reprisal. And we do that by documenting press freedom violations and trying to assist journalists who are in imminent risk as much as we are able to.
And Ignacio, tell us a bit about your job specifically. I know you have a very particular sort of remit.
Yeah, I'm the Middle East and North Africa representative. So I cover, among other countries, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel and Palestine, and Jordan. So yeah, that's basically the region I cover within MENA.
And shall I just throw on the screen the Missing Not Forgotten campaign?
Please.
So that, I'll just change the view so you can see that all closely. So then tell us about this campaign a little bit, Ignacio.
Yeah, that was a campaign that we launched recently. We launched it on August 30, which is International Day for Missing Persons. And the goal of this campaign was, again, to bring visibility to missing journalists and keep the pressure on governments so that they keep investigating, that they keep trying to find the whereabouts of missing journalists. Like we currently have like 64 journalists missing around the world, and a third of them are missing in the region that I cover, in MENA, especially in Iraq and in Syria, where 9 journalists in each country remain missing.
Shall I go to the next slide?
Yeah, that was a visualization that CPJ worked on just to highlight like where the journalists went missing or were detained, as was the case of Austin Tice. And as we can see, like it's 9 journalists scattered across the country, and most of them went missing under the terror reign of Islamic State.
All right. Well, thank you, Ignacio. Thank you for that quick overview of your work and obviously what CPJ itself is doing. Let me welcome Clarissa Ward. Welcome.
Hi.
And David Rohde, let me welcome you as well.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you.
And Ignacio, let me turn the proceedings over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandy. Well, like our 2 guests like need no presentation, unlike myself. So we have Clarissa Ward, it's a senior CNN international chief correspondent, and we have David Rohde, 2-time Pulitzer Award winner, and who is currently reporting for the New Yorker, but has previously worked for the Christian Science Monitor and New York Times. So I would like to kick off the discussion with you, Clarissa, since you have been doing like extensive reporting on Syria, especially like the numbers in Syria, like they paint a very grim picture for journalists. We have 138 journalists who have been killed as of today. 9 remain missing, others in prison. Like never before, like have we documented as many cases of abducted journalists as in Syria since 2011. So can you tell us, Clarissa, like from your experience, like what are the main risks that these journalists are facing? And especially freelancers and local journalists who usually account for the highest number of them.
Sure. Thank you, Ignacio. I mean, Syria, to cover Syria as a journalist was to have your heart broken in 100 different ways for many different reasons. And a big part of that, putting the conflict aside, was seeing the toll that this conflict took on journalists. And, you know, a lot of reporters I know will refer to journalists who do this kind of work as the tribe, sort of jokingly. And on one level, it sounds ridiculous. How are we a tribe? We're from different countries, we're different religions, we're different ages, we're different genders. There's almost nothing that binds us. And yet we are so profoundly connected by the nature of the work that we do. And when you're in these tough, dangerous places, you look out for each other. You have each other's backs. That's how you survive. Somebody needs a satellite phone, you got it. Somebody has run out of water in their car, they need a spare tire. Whatever it is that they need in the field, competition tends to go out the window a little bit. And the most important thing is that we are there for each other and we do support each other. And I like to think that that extends beyond our time on the ground in Syria. And if it takes 8 years, and Austin Tice is still missing, then we're still going to be talking about it. We're still going to be moving heaven and earth and doing whatever we can on a personal and a collective level to try to raise awareness and help bring our friend and our colleague home. Now, I think the reason that Syria was so horrifying for journalists, and you mentioned the freelancer point, which is really the crucial point here, because to illustrate this, I don't want to talk too long, but I want to just give you a sense of what the vetting process was for me versus Austin, okay? My friend, Austin Tice. The vetting process for me was I have to pitch it to CBS News. I have to go through endless rounds of security consultations to get a story like this cleared for me to go to Syria. I have to work with a security consultant who probably will have to travel into Syria with me. I have to do hostile environment training courses. I have to have proper body armor. I have to have a good fixer, Arabic speaker, someone familiar with the terrain lined up who I am working with. I have to have satellite phones. I have to have BGANs, which are portable satellites that allow us to transmit videos. I have to have all sorts of equipment for my security. And perhaps most importantly, I have to have something called K&R insurance, kidnap and ransom insurance. Now let me take you through what Austin had to have to get into Syria. Oh, a ticket to Antakya. And that's basically it. And, you know, Austin's extremely smart and incredibly experienced in conflict because of his military background. And so he had a lot of the right stuff, but he didn't have that full guarantee of support going in, coming from a major media organization, because the way it worked in Syria was that freelancers would go in, and if they got good stuff, they would try to sell it. And if those media organizations were interested in buying it, they would pay for it. But what this did was created a really dangerous environment whereby media organizations did not want to take responsibility for these freelancers. But they were willing to pay them for their work if they were going to go to the most dangerous places, right to the front lines, and get the most dramatic footage. If I wanted to go to the most dramatic places and dangerous places, I had to go through 7 levels of management. I had to do check-in calls every 3 or 4 hours. And I think that we've all learned a really valuable lesson from Syria, which is that we need to do better by our freelance colleagues. We need to ensure that they are afforded the same level of support that those of us who are fortunate enough to work for larger organizations are.
Yes, I fully agree with that, Clarissa. Like we know that since abductions started in Syria, especially, like it prevented a lot of international journalists, and especially after the horrific killings of Sotlov and Foley. So media outlets started relying heavily on either local journalists or freelancers to get material from Syria. But then again, they didn't commit to provide them with, as you said, like they need hostile environment training, insurance, the appropriate protective gear, and most of them didn't. So that's also like what the numbers are showing. So thank you for that, Clarissa. I would like to turn it over now to David. David, you have been also in the place of Austin, like you have been abducted. You were abducted in Afghanistan in 2008, and you managed to make escape. And also, like in Srebrenica, I understand like you were also detained for 10 days by Serbian troops after finding out about the mass graves in Srebrenica. What can you tell us, David, like about this experience and how, what was the impact like for you as you were abducted, and for the people back home? Like I'm sure there are many things that you can relate to from what the Tices have told us.
Thanks, Ignacio, and I agree with everything Clarissa just said about the broader dynamics in journalism today. One simple thing is like I have incredible admiration for Austin. My kidnapping was 7 months long. He's been held for 8 years. You know, my wife and family struggled for 7 months. Debbie and Marc have been fighting this fight for 8 years. It's just outrageous and completely unacceptable that the Syrian government continues to hold Austin. And, you know, I need to do more. We all need to do more. And you know, I'll be honest, there's a sense when this happens that to blame the journalists, that the journalists are sort of reckless. And we shouldn't be out reporting in these places. I went to interview a Taliban commander. He'd done a couple interviews with European journalists before me, hadn't kidnapped them. I assumed it was, you know, a safe interview. I regret that decision. But, you know, it's very important to remember that it is the perpetrator. It's the Assad regime that's at fault here. The Taliban commander, you know, who kidnapped me. And, you know, journalists you know, Austin was risking his life to inform Americans about what was happening in Syria. Clarissa still risks her life around the world doing that. So it's just vital. And I was lucky. I had a big news organization behind me. Just the last point, it's so much harder for the local journalists. You mentioned that I was able to escape. I escaped because of the courage of an Afghan journalist. There were 3 of us kidnapped, an Afghan driver and an Afghan journalist. You know, the journalist helped me escape. He knew, you know, we were being held. We'd been moved to a new location and we were near a Pakistani military base. You know, in the middle of the night while our guards were sleeping, we managed to escape, and he guided me to this Pakistani base and saved my life. So, you know, I'll stop there. But there is a huge problem now in journalism that Clarissa described, that huge resources for some and virtually no resources for freelancers and local journalists.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like recently, a French organization called AMSL, like they released a very interesting report. Like it's particularly about journalists in Syria. It's called Disposable Journalists. I think you can find it online, and it basically describes what you and Clarissa have just been describing, like this inequality in terms of resources or access to resources, access to insurance, and how this is changing like the whole dynamics in journalism. Another point that I would like to raise with you both, like we have heard Marc and Debra talk about like how hard it is to maintain this pressure, this attention. Like it's not, as Marc said, like it's not hard for them because they are parents, but they need to keep engaging the media community, the journalists, to keep the story alive, to keep the story in the media so that it won't be forgotten. In your case, David, like during the abduction, like the New York Times at the time decided to go a different way. Instead of going public, they decided like to keep a media blackout and to talk to other media outlets so that they won't publish any news about the abduction. Can you tell us, both of you, Clarissa and David, like what are the pros and cons of this approach, and how do you see it? Like in our experience, like we have seen both approaches. Journalists who have preferred to keep the story secret because they were either negotiating or they thought that media attention would be detrimental to their case, and others who went like full out public. What are your thoughts on this?
David, why don't you go first on that? Because I have a thought that's going to kind of piggyback onto
Sure.
that.
Look, keeping my case quiet was a well-intentioned effort. It was kind of, and by the way, it's been 12 years since I was kidnapped. Being kidnapped by the Taliban in 2008 is very different than being, kidnapped in Syria. It came out of this kind of model. There were a lot of kidnappings in Colombia, and the idea was that lots of publicity would raise the kidnappers' expectations for what kind of demands they could make. In my case, the Taliban wanted $25 million in cash, and the number fluctuated, but it was anywhere from 8 to 10 prisoners from Guantanamo. My family, the New York Times, didn't control prisoners. They didn't have that kind of money. So that was the philosophy. It didn't work. The Taliban were convinced that the U.S. government pays ransoms. The United States government does not pay ransoms. That's my personal experience. I've become friends with many former captives held in different places. The same thing happened there. And then a broader problem, and I diverge a bit, is that some European governments do indirectly pay ransoms. As you mentioned, Steve Foley and James Stotloff were murdered. There were French and other European journalists who were freed after ransoms were paid. So it's a longer discussion, but I would urge families to speak loudly from the beginning. And the shift now is that it's governments. It's less jihadists, it's more governments. It's more cases like Austin, where authoritarian regimes are trying to silence reporters or use them as chits. So it's governments that are the threats now.
And I think just, piggybacking on what David's saying, what becomes so difficult is, let's use Marc and Debbie as an example, who we just heard from, who have demonstrated incredible resilience, strength, smarts, and have moved heaven and earth to try to bring Austin home. But imagine those first moments, okay, where they're finding out that Austin has disappeared. How are they equipped in those first moments to be making these big decisions like, do we do a media blackout? Who do we consult about? Do we consider a rescue mission? Do we go through the State Department first? Do we call in a sort of, risk consultancy group? Do we have a private security company that's near that border? These are decisions that need to be made very quickly. And they need to be made by people who have a lot of experience working in the, terrible world of kidnappings. And it, again, places freelancers at such a disadvantage when they don't have those kinds of resources immediately and a clear sense of like, this is the person who is the point person, who is making the decisions, who is coming up with what the strategy is, who is deciding if there is going to be a media blackout. And they're making those decisions based on years and years of experience. We have seen some progress. I was talking with someone from the Rory Peck Foundation, which supports freelancers. We're talking about a group called the Emergency Response Program, that freelancers are more and more getting access to, in terms of providing a point person who will take on that role if and when it becomes, unfortunately, so to pass that is necessary. And then the other thing that David touched on that I also think is so important is this issue of paying ransoms. And is that allowed, and is that not allowed, and who can do it and who can't do it? And again, I think there needs to be a much more transparent conversation about the whole issue of ransom. I think we did see that in the fallout of the Obama administration after the death of Jim Foley and Steve Sotloff and Pete Kassig, and the whole debate that came as a result of that about whether they really needed to die or whether they could have been saved if ransoms were paid, and whether the parents should have been put in that position of essentially being intimidated into not paying those ransoms. Like, these are hugely important issues that need to be articulated in a transparent way, so that, again, not just freelancers, but local journalists, news organizations are all on the same page, are all singing from the same song sheet. To put us in a better position, again, to look out for each other and to protect each other.
Yeah, I fully agree. Like, thank you both for these insights. Like, that's often the case during our work. Like, before we launched the campaign, like for a year, we were tracking relatives of missing journalists in both Syria and Iraq. In many cases, they have been displaced themselves, so it was hard work. And as you were mentioning, Clarissa, like, they didn't have like any access or any idea of how do I deal with this? Whom can I resort to? Uh, whom can I talk to? And it's often the case that they spend years like just following rumors or opportunists trying to make money out of the suffering of these families. So yeah, I do agree we need like this collective conversation just to figure out like what's the best way to go about ransoms, kidnappings, and missing. Like how can we articulate this like in a more organized way and in a global way. There's another point that I would like to discuss. Like recently, we have had like very good news on the accountability front. Two suspects of the killing of James Foley and Sotloff have been now extradited to the US, and they will be facing trial. David, I know like also one of the persons responsible for your abduction is now in the US and will be facing trial. I know you cannot comment a lot on this, but yeah, I would like to know your thoughts on this. Like, what do you think about this news? Like, can we finally hope that we can get accountability? Also, I also want to mention the case of Mary Colvin. Like the Syrian government was declared also guilty of her killing by a U.S. federal court. So now arrest warrants could be issued against senior Syrian officials for that too. Do you think are these good signals? Do you think these are exceptions? Like, what are your thoughts on this?
It's such an
I think
interesting question. No, go ahead, David. Sorry.
it's fine, Clarissa, if you want to go.
No, go.
I think this is all good progress. And let me sort of say, I can't comment on my own case as a pending kind of criminal investigation at trial, so I can't say anything. I think the two individuals, who've been brought to the U.S. to stand trial for the murders of Stephen Sotloff and Jim Foley, that is progress. The Colvin family has been extraordinary in their efforts. And I kind of want to emphasize some positive things here. Clarissa mentioned like the Rory Peck Trust. That's there's a lot of organizations doing amazing things that, people can engage in and help and support if they want. So the Rory Peck Trust helps freelancers all over the world. CPJ, Ignacio is being very polite and humble here, just does an incredible job of holding governments worldwide to account. It's a US-based organization, but there's an annual survey they do of how many journalists are in jail. It includes local journalists. Again, the tactic of these increasingly emboldened authoritarian regimes is to crush the local journalist and the local freelancer, and CPJ doesn't let them get away with that. In terms of in the US, there's a nonprofit group that was started called Hostage US. It was actually, they have a chapter in the UK that started even earlier. It was organized by families of captives to give each other advice about how to handle those first moments of a kidnapping. Many families don't know it exists, but they've been trying to work with families in the US government to be there as a resource for people. And then there's a separate thing formed, too many, all these acronyms. It's called a Culture of Safety Alliance. It was an effort by freelance journalists, the Frontline Freelance Register. That's another organization. It's kind of a union, an association, if you will, of freelancers. Got together with a bunch of editors. I was one of them. I was an editor at Reuters at the time. And it's kind of a compact about editors not doing what Clarissa talked about, which is sending the freelancers off, seeing what they get, creating a race to the bottom to get the footage and the photographs and the reporting, and then paying for it. And the idea is to have conversations beforehand between freelancers and editors at news organizations about the risks they're going to take. What are they going to do if something goes wrong? Frankly, a common thing, not in a war zone, is like a car accident. Like, how do you cover the pandemic in a safe and responsible way? many dozens of news organizations have signed on to that. There's freelancer sort of training that ACOS Alliance funds around the world, but it's all very small. But I just want to, and I'll stop here. Good things are happening. People are fighting back, you know, and you know, we all have more information about this if anybody's interested. But I just want to emphasize that these cases, these arrests, these groups that are fighting are all great news.
I would echo what David's saying about, you know, Ignacio, the work that you guys are doing at the CPJ. It's so important. It is so vital, honestly, because it is exhausting to be out there every day just ringing that bell like, no, sorry, we need to talk about this person and that person, and it's vitally important, and it's a hugely important service. So I also share the sense of well, I'm hopeful that there will be justice for Steve Sotloff and Jim Foley. I'm glad that there has been moves to get some justice for Marie Colvin, even if it's largely symbolic, really. But what I do think is interesting is when you have this conversation, you realize that there is a dichotomy between Western journalists and local journalists. And Western journalists tend to precipitate more action from people. You know, Austin Tice is not the only American, well, he's the only American journalist, but he's not the only American being held in Syria, but he's definitely getting much more attention. And I look at the journalists in Mexico who are being killed, you know, on a far too frequent basis, covering the drug war there. And I don't see any justice for them. And I would also just say more broadly that I look at the cultural shift and the sort of tone change in positions of power, the disparagement of journalists. And that does concern me, not for my own personal safety, but because of those local journalists who I mentioned. When they are living in countries and authoritarians feel emboldened, feel that it is open season on journalists, and feel that maybe the rest of us are not all able to have the backs of our colleagues, I think that creates a slightly dangerous environment. So yes, I welcome the fact that there will be these prosecutions, and I'm optimistic about seeing more justice for journalists, but I still see, more broadly speaking, a lot of doom and gloom as well, I have to be honest.
I thank you both for your kind words about CPJ, and of course, like all the partners who are doing also a terrific job trying to protect journalists around the world, provide them with insurance and the like. And I'm glad that you touched this final point, Clarissa, like this inequality between Western journalists and local journalists. Like most of the cases that we report on are local journalists. In fact, like out of the 138 journalists who were killed in Syria, 90% of them are local. And they don't have the same sort of access to media. They don't have the same sort of access to international organizations who are also working on issues of missing journalists, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, the UN Group on Enforced Disappearances. Like they don't have access to it, they don't have the knowledge. So we should definitely keep fighting this and fighting impunity, which is one of the biggest problems that we are facing, journalists are facing worldwide. Like hundreds of journalists, dozens of journalists are killed or imprisoned, and it rarely has like any sort of consequence for the governments, the militias, the non-state actors holding them. So that's why I think we cling, especially those working in this field, we cling to this good news, like seeing that some justice is achieved in those cases. And yeah, like we need those good news to keep fighting, because as you were both saying, the news on the press freedom front are not great. We are seeing a decline in that. We are seeing journalists being slandered, declared as enemies. And yeah, that's something that we should all keep in mind. So I thank you both, David and Clarissa. If you have like any further thoughts before we go to the Q&A.
I just want to encourage people to keep engaging and to be optimistic. Like again, Austin has held out, for 8 years. There were Americans, who've been held just as long. And I think we just owe it to him to keep trying. And people want us to be cynical and give up. These regimes and these groups want us to shake our heads and throw up our hands, and we just can't do that. So I just respect the Tices and Austin so much, and thanks you guys for. Anyway, I'm happy to take questions, but I'm just grateful for this event and for everybody who's watching.
Yeah, I would echo that again. And also just to say, knowing Austin personally and knowing what a fighter he is, I know he will get through this somehow. And I think, we need to keep him in our thoughts, not just as like a figure for what he represents, but also just for the like all round awesome human being and friend and brother and son and a boyfriend and ex-husband that he is as well. He's a tremendous individual, and we all miss him very much.
Yeah, I join you both in that. Like, let's hope that Austin is home as soon as possible.
So let's turn to the audience Q&A. And folks, if you still have a question to ask, please enter it into the Q&A box. We have a lot of questions here. I'm going to start with a question from one of our interns, who's a fabulous young woman named Sydney Pope. And she asks for both of you, and I know, Clarissa, you mentioned this when you were talking, and maybe we'll start with you, Clarissa. How often have you had to use your de-escalation and hostile environment training when reporting abroad? What's usually the outcome, and how does it actually feel to put that training into practice?
It's a really good question because it's kind of a very subtle thing, I would say. Like we tend to make fun of it when we're doing the courses because it seems like not that realistic, despite the best efforts. And you're like, how does this actually work? But when you put it together with the experience of continuously traveling to these places and having been in certain situations, you do build, it's an education, right? And you build a baseline understanding of like, this is how I behave in X, Y, or Z situation. And I, on a completely insignificant by comparison to David's experience, and certainly or any of these other experiences, but I remember being detained for the day in Eastern Ukraine by pro-Russian separatists, and we were blindfolded and driven off, and we were interrogated on video camera and had to sign and I remember thinking, okay, I've done this before, because this is the sort of thing you do get a sort of a practice round at in your hostile environment training. Now, that doesn't mean that makes it any less terrifying, frankly. But it does mean that in the back of your mind somewhere, you're like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do in this situation. Or for me, I don't remember all of the first aid, but I always have my tourniquet with me. And I know that if something really bad happens, I know how to tie that tourniquet. And that is the most basic thing there is in first aid in conflict zones, but that is the thing that will save lives. So I think it's difficult to quantify exactly how much it helps, but certainly I don't think anyone should be going into a war zone. And Austin's a very different situation because he obviously had operated in war zones. No one should be going into a war zone without at least doing a hostile environment course and spending some time getting familiar with the basic concepts of war, because none of us experienced it for the most part growing up.
David, do you want to address that question as well?
I just would. It's the same issue with disparity in that freelancers don't have any of this training. They don't know what to do. It does help you, as Clarissa talked about. When I was kidnapped and driven off and blindfolded, it did help me kind of, calm down and think of the right things to say. So it's there needs to be more training. There needs to be more. We keep saying the same thing, but more resources going to local journalists and freelance journalists.
So there's a couple questions here around the aspect of freelance journalists, and I guess I'll just combine them together. One is really whose responsibility is it? Does anyone bear responsibility to protect and or provide security and training for freelance journalists? And maybe a connected question is, are there any collective efforts to provide this kind of protection for independent journalists? And I throw that, maybe I'll start with you, David, on that.
Yeah, I would say, so I'm an evil editor now. I'm the executive editor for news at the New Yorker website. I get freelance pitches all the time. I struggle to answer all of them. There's freelancers who could be watching this saying, that jerk, he's just answering my email. I've become, the editor I didn't like. But it's my responsibility. And it's easy for me, at the New Yorker to kind of say, we're not going to take that story, we're not going to take that risk in that story with this, young writer, I don't know, because we don't have to cover everything. But one of the things about this, again, is the collective effort, the question, a culture of safety alliance, ACOS Alliance, is that it's editors, there's 7 principles that freelancers sign on to and 7 principles that editors sign on to. The first one that the freelancer signs on to is that I won't go on a dangerous assignment unless I've got proper training. The first thing that the editor signs on to is that the news organization is responsible for the well-being of the journalist, the translator, the driver, everyone, once you've commissioned the assignment. And you're either, all in, in doing that assignment, or you're not, or you're just not going to take it. So I think it's really important that news organizations take responsibility in these cases. It's also important, for, I think, and I think the Frontline Freelance Register and Rory Peck Trust is changing the culture there too, where you don't just, go headlong into one of these situations as a freelancer. Just the last thing, I had the very brief 10-day thing in Bosnia that Ignacio mentioned. I had 7 months in Afghanistan. If this thing happens to you, I'm saying this to younger freelancers, it'll set back your career. Whatever you did, you'll be labeled as kind of reckless. A little bit of that happened to me the second time around, but then I had just gotten married. So my second kidnapping I chose to end my career as a foreign correspondent. I miss it. Others don't do that. But I just, it's not fair to this generation of journalists, but the stakes are higher. It was easier to run around and cover Bosnia, 25 years ago. Now you're more of a target. So I just think things are improving, and I'm very proud of the ACOS Alliance and everything we're doing.
Well, David, you raised the point, so I'm just going to follow up. There's a question here from one of our board members. How did you handle mentally your condition of confinement? Can you give us a little bit of a window into how difficult that was for you?
It doesn't seem real at first. And again, it's 12 years ago. It was 7 months. I was given bottled water. It was very clear from the beginning the Taliban wanted to kind of keep me alive and get the highest price they could. The very simple thing, and I want to keep these answers short so people can ask questions. Look, 8 years. I don't know how you do it. It's like anybody or you yourself, there's people probably watching this, who get a potentially fatal medical diagnosis. You've got cancer, and it's amazing what the human mind does. You start functioning. You're facing your own mortality. You might not survive it. That there's certain things you can do, rounds of chemotherapy, and it might save your life. But it's amazing, and I think people would do it. Whatever the human mind, the human spirit, you break the day down and you get through the days, and it's brutal and grueling. And I think over time it wears you down. Again, Austin, 8 years, amazing. But it's folks watching this could do it as well. I don't know about 8 years, but so it was. So many people in our lives show courage all the time. So I just don't want people to think it's that much, it was terrible, but people go through terrible things bravely and get no recognition for it all the time.
And David, last question about this, and then we'll move on to other subjects. What was your emotional reaction in learning that your abductors have been identified and are going to be prosecuted?
I am not going to comment. Sorry. And there's a pending trial, and I might have to be a witness in that trial. I take that very seriously. So I don't want to prejudice that proceeding in any way. I want this person to get a fair trial.
Fair enough. Thank you. Clarissa, let me ask you, there's a question in the Q&A box. Are women journalists more likely to be targeted in the field than men? Are there major distinctions that we should draw between male and female reporters, whether they're freelance or attached to a news organization?
I get asked this a lot, and I actually feel like it might even be the reverse sometimes. I often feel that as a woman, particularly in very conservative Muslim societies, I'm seen as less of a threat. People are more uncomfortable dealing with me often even, and so don't really want to try to engage me in any way. And certainly when we look at journalists there's lots of women reporters who did fantastic work in Syria, but we did not see women being kidnapped, certainly in the same way, obviously the death of Marie Colvin, but we did not see women being kidnapped in the same way, obviously with the exception of Kayla Mueller. That's a slightly different situation. So I think for the most part, actually being a woman can sometimes be an asset in that setting where I can wear traditional clothing, an abaya or a hijab, and maybe be a little bit more under the radar. And I'm sometimes afforded this privileged position of being like an honorary man, is how sometimes Western female journalists have been referred to in Afghanistan. But then you would look at other countries and you have very high risk of sexual assault. And I remember during this very brief detention I had, the only thing I was concerned about, because it was while everything was happening in Syria, and I understood that this was not going to be a situation where I was going to be executed or anything like that. But I did have a brief moment of worrying as they were taking all our jewelry off, and there was a young man militant who was doing that, and he was sort of touching me. And that was a reminder that, okay, there are different threats you can face, though. It's not always about the threat of being held by jihadists or being executed. And I do think that women, of course, are particularly susceptible or vulnerable to sexual assault. And unfortunately, we don't talk about it that much. There's still a bit of a taboo around it, particularly for local journalists who I think experience it a lot more. And I can only hope that we have that conversation a bit more openly and make it try to unpack some of the shame that can come with it.
So a question here from a retired journalist here in Santa Fe, Phil Cook, and he is asking for more explanation of some of the motives for the kidnapping of journalists. There's the obvious, ransom or political pressure on the country of origin to halt or influence the work of foreign correspondents. Are there other elements? And maybe we can refer specifically to Austin's case in terms of why, what's happening? What are the rationale of groups to abduct or worse journalists?
Clarissa, you go first here on Austin.
Well, I just would comment on Austin because Austin was doing incredibly daring work. I mean, he was getting to places in Syria that nobody else was getting to. And I don't know anybody else who takes the summer off from law school and within 2 weeks, having never written an article in their lives, is filing for the Washington Post. I mean, I was at the time, I was like, you're so annoying. Like, that's not a thing. People don't do that. But he did, and he was quite vocal about it. And he did care a lot about the Syrian people, and he did feel passionately about it, and he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. And so he was a very obvious target for the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which I think we have seen over and over again has absolutely no respect for journalists or frankly for human life in general. And going off what we saw with Marie Colvin's targeting and killing, unfortunately, it's a natural assumption that because Austin was, in a sense, making them look foolish, because he was, they're there saying, oh, no, the capital's fine, we're in control. And there was Austin right in Damascus or in the suburbs in Daraya with the rebels being like, the revolution is nipping at your heels and it's here. And so I think they probably, I would imagine they mobilized a fair amount of effort to making sure that he was stopped in his tracks.
Yeah, and I would say it's to silence people. The Bosnian Serbs, detained me after I found a mass grave, the bodies of Bosnian Muslims they had killed around the town of Srebrenica. And then for these groups, it's a big deal for a commander to get a foreign captive. So it's publicity, it's money that they think they can get, and it's changed. I mean, just a change in journalism. In Bosnia, we had satellite phones. Like the two sides needed to get their stories out through us, just technologically. That's changed. Any insurgent, can post anything they want online and get their message out. So there's kind of less, dependence on journalists, less respect for journalists, and more view of journalists as targets that can produce, cachet and, money and publicity.
Yeah, if I may chime in, Sandy, there's also the fact that these regimes, especially in Syria that we are mentioning like time and again, they perceive journalists, local or foreign, as spies in many cases. And it's just because these regimes, or even like non-state actors like Islamic State in its time, like they wanted full control of the narrative, full control of the flow of information. So having people questioning their narratives constantly, like they annoy them incredibly. So one of the first things that Islamic State did after taking over Mosul in Iraq was take over all the media outlets in the city and impose a media blackout. So there was no information in or out that they couldn't control. So that's also one of the reasons why like journalists are being increasingly targeted.
Let's talk a little bit about this unique year of 2020. Of course, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and we have lots of evidence from around the world that more authoritarian leaders are using the pandemic as a smokescreen to clamp down on journalism, on journalists. Has the pandemic, has the context of this year influenced in a negative way the persecution of journalists around the world, with particular attention to a lot of the issues we're talking about here? David, why don't I throw that one to you first?
I'm gonna come at this kind of sideways, and again, the glass half full thing. I think the pandemic has shown the importance of reliable information to the public. Here in the U.S., we can't agree on whether we're wearing masks, but it's shown, that, and frankly, the importance of nonpartisan public service. People, depending on where you're on the political spectrum, either love Dr. Tony Fauci or hate him. But I do think, and I'll end with the short answer, but I do think it's made, I think people realize how vetting information is worthwhile. It can be a life and death thing. And also that there's an explosion of misinformation and disinformation online. Misinformation being, things people spread that they don't realize is wrong. Disinformation being intentionally false information. And so it's been a horrible experience, the pandemic, but I do think, it's taught people vetted, accurately reported information is valuable.
Clarissa, you want to add to that at all?
Well, I know, I just feel like I'm always the doommeister because David's like glass half full and I'm like, oh gosh, glass half empty, because no, glass is half full, definitely. But also glass is half empty at the same time, in the sense that, I can't tell you how many people have sent me things that are just ridiculous. This documentary, Plandemic. I have people coming up and asking me if it's true that the vaccine was created by the Chinese military academy in Wuhan. And every day it's something new. And these aren't stupid people even. These are people who are struggling to get their head around how to synthesize information effectively and understand what is vetted and what is valuable and what is misinformation, or more sinisterly, disinformation, as David talks about. So I think that the pandemic has provided a really great opportunity for those state and non-state actors who are actively engaged in disinformation to seize the vacuum and take advantage of the chaos, take advantage of the fear, and pump out all sorts of nonsense that overwhelms often ordinary people who don't have a good handle on how to navigate this stuff.
Ignacio, a question from one of our high school fellows. Do we know how many freelance journalists are being held around the world, not only in conflict zones, but of course in other countries as well?
And like currently, like this is some work that we are doing, as David mentioned earlier. Like we're working on our annual prison census. So last year, if I'm not mistaken, the count was 248 journalists in prison worldwide. I do not have like off the top of my head like the figure for freelancers, but it's, as we said, like it's an increasing number. Like in every country you look into, they're usually the most vulnerable. So the most easy to arrest, kill, simply because they don't have like either the protection or because they have to run more risk than others to get the story. So yeah, right now like I don't have like a figure off the top of my head, but that's the case.
And the vast majority are local journal. I mean, they work for like a Turkish newspaper, or right? It's not the Westerners like Clarissa and I who are jailed. Right?
Yeah, exactly. When I mean local, yeah, it's Syrian journalists working for a media office in their hometown, or for a Turkish-based media outlet in Arabic, or for local news outlets.
So maybe we will just wrap up with one final question. We have lots of students participating in the conference in New Mexico and around the country, and even around the world. So maybe I'll ask each of you, and David, I'll start with you. What piece of advice would you give a young journalist, whether freelance or attached to an organization, going to go and report from a hostile environment? What would you tell them, things to do or not to do? What's your advice?
Patience. You're going to email jerk editors like me, and they're not going to answer. You're going to, keep sending those editors emails. Sends them 3 emails or 4 or 5 emails, and if they don't answer, then give up. There are no dumb questions. If you like, when there are other journalists around, I'm sheepish about my quasi semi-retired state here, but like, when I covered the war in Bosnia, I was in my late 20s. There was a journalist with The Guardian named Julian Borger, who was older than me and knew what he was doing. A journalist named John Pomfret with the Washington Post. Ask other journalists for help. It's a tribe, as Clarissa says. There are no dumb questions when you're covering a dangerous story. And, another, I'll do these P's, pay, like ask before you, I know, get some clips. It's easier than ever to get published now because you have the infinite web. It's harder than ever to get properly paid for your work. So get those clips in a smart, safe way. Go maybe to a part of the world you love and spend several years there, becoming an expert in it. But then sort of, be patient and sort of stick up for yourself when you're negotiating with editors and when you're picking where to take risks. And it'll pay off with patience and perseverance. I pitched freelance pieces. I mean, I had this whole series in my career of sort of pitching places, and they would never, take my assignments. The first piece I wrote for the New York Times got a huge correction on it. I thought I was doomed. So, and just, keep at it. And thank you. We desperately need a new generation to join the tribe. A new, and I should say, diverse generation. And Clarissa's being, polite about all the garbage women have to put up with, but journalists of color, women, journalists from around the world, this is a calling, and it's more important than ever. And I encourage you, and I thank you for being interested in this.
Yeah, and I really agree with that. It is a calling. And if it's not a calling, if it's like, maybe I would do this, maybe this could be, no, it's not going to happen for you. You have to want this so much. You have to feel that there is nothing else you could do, because as David said, you're going to face a lot of rejection. You're going to face a lot of frustration. There are going to be times in your mid-20s where you're like, wait, this wasn't my life plan. Like, I'm not supposed to be working on the overnight assignment desk. I'm supposed to be in Baghdad. And that's just the reality. But I think David also touched on one of the most important things, which is particularly in television, where it's such a team sport and so collaborative, find a mentor. Find a rabbi. That is going to be so important to you, to have that person that you can be like, is this a crazy story for me to pitch? Or how should I behave when I, go into a mosque? Or how should I navigate this situation? Or what should I ask this editor for? You need people who are going to support you. And I honestly, every week, I talk to at least 2 or 3 aspiring young journalists. I will always talk to you. I will promise. Contact me on social media. I promise you, I will take the time to talk to you, because I believe in paying it forward. And I believe, as David said, that we need to be, nurturing a kick-ass generation of new journalists. Your job is going to be harder than ever because of all the nonsense out there trying to disparage and undermine this important work fundamentally. And there are lots of us who desperately want to give you all the tools you can do to go out there and kick ass. So please ask for advice, ask questions. And yeah, you got to want it though. Really, really got to want it.
Ignacio, last word to you from where you sit, obviously, in helping to protect journalists. What would you advise young journalists to do or not do?
Like, especially that's something that I think both David and Clarissa have also mentioned. It's before you go on assignment, make sure first that you want it, and then like do a proper risk assessment. What are the dangers that you are going to face? Are you ready for those dangers? Are you prepared? Do you have the appropriate training? Do you have the appropriate gear? Is it going to pay off even financially? Because that's often like an angle that we like. Going to report on a conflict zone, it's very expensive. Like, you need a lot of money, and sometimes, like as a freelancer, like the fees that they pay you per piece, per article, per video are not that steep. So make sure also that it's going to pay off. But yeah, I think like before you go anywhere, make sure that you are prepared to get into that.
Well, thank the 3 of you very, very much. Thank you, Clarissa Ward. Thank you, David Rohde. Thank you, Ignacio Delgado Culebras. Thank you so much for this really important discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do so.
Thank you. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you. People can contact me on social media too.
Wonderful. And for those of you here still, we will be reconvening at 1 o'clock Mountain Time to hear Malachi Brown from the New York Times talk about his amazing digital forensics work. Debra, thank you so much too for popping back on. And thank you, Marc, and thank you, Pat. That was a really, really fascinating session. Thank you for joining us. And then, of course, we'll be back tonight at 5:30 Mountain to hear Dana Priest interview EJ Dion. So we have lots of fun stuff coming. Once again, thank you to our panelists so much, and we will see the rest of you soon.